Hello and welcome to Jo's Art History Podcast, a podcast which celebrates all things art historical with me, your host and your resident art historian, Jo McLaughlin. Hello and welcome back. It is episode 51 and today, doubly special, it's the 8th of March, which is not only my birthday, thank you very much, it is also International Women's Day. So what better way to mark the occasion than by bringing you small snippets of 4 previous episodes which celebrated 4 amazing female artists. Now, this will be a little bit of a deep dive back into some of our episodes, and we'll reintroduce you to the wonderful Anna Atkins, Frida Kahlo, British designer Peggy Angus, and of course it wouldn't be International Women's Day without a little bit of a deep dive into Tracey Emin, where we revisit the episode where I spoke with the brilliant British photographer Kerry Curl to talk about Tracey Emin's bed. So, could you think of a better way to celebrate International Women's Day? I know I couldn't. Well, apart from birthday cake, obviously, but that's because it's the same day, which I will be enjoying later this evening. Thank you very much. But for now, just sit back and relax as I bring you Jo's Art History Podcast's International Women's Day special. Enjoy! And happy International Women's Day. So interestingly enough, I completely forgot that last year my International Women's Day special was all about Anna Atkins, but it's by complete coincidence with this year that I'm going to be kicking off with Anna as well. So who is Anna Atkins? And if you've never heard of her, well, you will definitely not forget her after you hear a little bit about her when I speak to the wonderful Josie Purcell. Anna Atkins was the first person ever to create a photo book with her 1843 photographs of British algae, cyanotyped impressions. How did she create that, I hear you ask? Well, using the cyanotype printing process. In this little snippet, Josie introduces us to Anna Atkins, her process, and just what a cyanotype is. Enjoy. So, as well as the family connections as well, she was, her dad was part of different scientific societies, and I think Anna herself was part of a female society as well, where female sort of botanist society.
Yes, she was granted membership of the Royal Botanic Society of London. I think that was in about 1839, and that was really one of the only places then that women were allowed. Because who knows what who knows what we would have got up to if we'd been allowed in other places back then. But anyway, yeah, that was one of the places that was allowed. I guess I don't know this for a fact, but I imagine it's because in the sort of Victorian era, scrapbooking plants and flowers, having herbariums and botany was considered this okay pastime for women to have an interest in. So possibly more, not to say that take anything away from botany as a science and a topic, but I guess maybe that's why they allowed women in, whereas the others didn't, and had stricter sort of rules about who could be involved. But her father did at least share all his knowledge from his fellowship of the Royal Society. So he would go to lectures and share papers with us and include her. And I think at one point she may have been allowed into some of the meetings. So, her father was a huge influence on her, and they had a really good bond there. So I guess in that way, having a father who wanted her to achieve and follow her passion was an absolute benefit for her to be able to go on and make these cyanotypes in the future.
Yeah, well, that's it exactly. It really is incredible when you think about it. This is a time when really a woman's job was to be a mother and a housewife and not to be sort of gallivanting, if you will, and having conversations with scientists and also sort of contributing to science and art in any sort of way. What I love though is I read this thing that was talking about, like you just said there, her dad was brilliant at sort of sharing his knowledge and encouraging her. But what I really love is these conversations were happening about, the development of photography and these different types of exposure and documentation of how it could benefit botanists and not just botany, science in general and these developments. But it took Anna, a woman, to be the first one to actually be like,
okay, I'm going to try this and see what
Well,
happens.
absolutely. I mean, I think from sort of the age of 20 or so, you know, and growing up, I guess, as well, but definitely from the age of 20, in her 20s, she'd started this collection of finding seaweeds and plants and lichens and all ferns, etc. So she built up this herbarium over these years. The thought of having to illustrate all of this to be able to share it with people was quite daunting. I think I've read that she had over 1,500 seaweed specimens, just the seaweed element of her collection. So you can imagine her scratching her head and thinking, I'm never going to be able to draw all of these. And I think also what she was really sort of craving was not just sort of how on earth could you ever draw all of this and to be able to share it with people easily and readily, but the detail of a way of sort of being able to replicate the detail and capture that detail as well. So when she obviously learned from Sir John Herschel about the cyanotype process and saw it in action, I guess that was her light bulb moment really for fantastic, this is now my way of being able to show people and share all these findings and all this sort of knowledge from this collection so that other botanists, other scientists could look at it and learn from it. And also, I guess, just appreciate its beauty for what it is as well.
Well, that's it. And these are incredibly beautiful, detailed studies, images, photographs. I mean, there's so many things that they fall under, but I think it's really important to reiterate that, just like you said, if she didn't use this process before this was invented, you had to physically illustrate everything. And when I was reading for this and I read this sentence where someone was like, you know, because before this there was, you had illustrators, and when I was at university we looked at James Cook's Voyages of Discovery in the South Pacific, and it was very common that any sort of big voyage that you took a voyage artist, and because they were essentially the person that illustrated what the botanists and the scientists that also went on these explorations. And it's like you said, it's incredibly laborious, it's so time consuming. And also another question I have is, where on earth did she get seaweed in London, which is a complete curveball.
I guess I mean, I really don't know for sure, but she lived sort of and grew up in Kent, and I presume that she sort of travelled to the coast, or perhaps worked with others who were collecting. I mean, I really don't know for sure how she actually laid her hands on all of these amazing specimens, you know, to build up this huge collection that she had. I like to sort of imagine her, you know, going off to the seaside and maybe tucking some sort of seaside samples under a skirt or something. I don't really know.
Yeah.
But I don't really know for sure. But I'm just really glad that she did, and that she was able to share, you know, sort of not fate, but just sort of circumstances collided and brought her to the cyanotype process so that she was able to share it. And I think it's sort of talking about sort of how she sort of collected and this connection to nature as well. And I think because the process just uses these two chemicals that when mixed together they become light sensitive, you can place your items on top of treated paper or another surface, expose them in sunlight and rinse them with water, fix the image with water. So it's such a lovely, simple way of almost sort of connecting back, I guess, almost to particularly like with the seaweed, it's come out of the sea, it's been, you know, it's at the ocean, on the shoreline, all of that, and you're working in a way that actually is kind, I guess, in a way to sort of the items you're using. I mean, obviously they're still chemicals, but so it's just that beautiful sort of a connection back to the natural items, and that I really like as well. But I think if anyone ever makes a cyanotype, or if anyone listens to this and think, oh, I'm going to give it a go, I mean, even now, even though I've actually made hundreds of them, it's still it's still an exciting, beautiful sort of moment when you create something this way. And I can imagine back then sort of her being able to see all these different flora that she had sort of just magically appearing in front of her eyes in such detail. And I think that's what obviously inspired her to go, this is the way for me to share all of my botanical specimens with a wider audience. And it was her 1843. So the process was invented in 1842, and it was in 1843 that she produced her first book, Photographs of British Algae, Cyanotype Impressions. I mean, every time she produced a volume, she had to do it from scratch. She couldn't she couldn't just scan it and print another copy out. So a lot of work, a lot of dedication, I think, to getting what she'd done out there. So absolutely fabulous. And I know, I believe her father was very supportive of this, obviously, and sent on copies of these volumes that she'd made to British Museum, Kew Gardens, lots of other scientists, Royal Society. So helped really share what she'd made.
Yeah, and what is incredible, and I think people at home need to understand, is when we're talking about the cyanotype process, like you said, that she had to go back and redo them. Every time you make a cyanotype, it's a unique impression, is it not?
Even if you're using, I would say, even if you can obviously use specimens, so leaves, because of Anna, I think, and one of the beautiful, and even now, is when people make cyanotypes with ferns. I mean, if you go on Pinterest or do a Google search, and you will no doubt discover that one of the first things people do is try and make a cyanotype with a fern. It's still a beautiful image, image, and obviously why it's so people are drawn to ferns, I think, in particular. But even if you use found objects like that from nature, or a pair of scissors, for instance. Someone, I can't remember his name, I feel so bad now, but some beautiful images that were made with old cassette tapes with the tape pulled out.
Lovely.
Or negatives. You can actually use negatives. I mean, I would always say that you don't use original negatives if you can sort of scan and print out digital negatives. So you can use negatives to actually make these contact prints as well. But invariably, you could say each one is unique, because when you expose it, the amount of time you expose it, the way the paper's been coated, so many different things will actually have a slightly different impact on the result. So you might be using the same negative, but if you're making an original print every time, it will be slightly different from the other one in some form or other. I mean, there might be people who love cyanotypes and are very, very, perhaps a bit more stricter than I am, who might dispute me. But I think overall, yes, each one is going to have a difference in some way or another.
Yeah, and just to again hit home when we're saying, she had to make these, the unique things. She had to, every time she made a copy of her first book, which she then proceeded to make, one volume, then became 3 volumes. But in the first volume alone, she has over 400
I know,
cyanotypes.
It's absolutely crazy. And I just, I think it was over about 10 years. So she sort of did the first book, the algae book. And I always wonder if I say that right, because some people say algae, don't they? Anyway, I'm digressing.
I was worried that I would say cyanotype incorrect, or so don't worry.
So that was first, and she went on in sort of the next 10 years. I think by 1853 she'd made another volume for British and foreign ferns, and also in 1854 another one for British and foreign flowering plants and ferns, which she made with her friend called Anne Dixon. So I think over that sort of 10-year period, she was pretty busy, sort of creating these volumes of different specimens that she wanted to share. But I think one of the interesting things that I really like is apparently she signed them AA, so just with her initials. And then after her death, I don't know how long after her death, but apparently after her death, it was decided that AA stood for Anonymous Author. So it wasn't until later that I think whoever twigged, someone obviously twigged and thought, no, this is Anna Atkins' work. This is not an anonymous author. Yeah, so I think she's quite fortunate not to have, as often with I guess again talking about sort of women in science and history and perhaps in other fields as well, can often be sort of overtaken or ignored or forgotten. So it's really nice that she hasn't been forgotten for that. And I really like the fact as well that she is seen and as the first person really to make a photo book. And photo books are beautiful and absolutely wonderful to look at. So her being sort of the first, and all that time and effort that she put into creating it.
And if you want to hear more from the episode, you can go back and find that. It's episode 23 from season 1, and that is Anna Atkins and the cyanotype with Josie Purcell. And thank you one more time to Josie. It's a really fantastic episode, and Anna really wouldn't have been on my radar had Josie not written in and asked to come on and talk about her. She's a really fascinating character, and interestingly enough, cyanotype is still a relatively popular printing process, and I did actually have a little go after I recorded the podcast. It's really great fun, and I've recently just started a new job, and part of my role recently, I was doing some copywriting and researching of someone's collection and sort of putting together information for their online archive. And there was a few cyanotypes that were included in there. So it was a really lovely nod, and I felt like it's something I could talk about at great length, and it's just a fantastic episode. So please do give it a listen. And also Josie herself has started her own podcast where she talks about photography and lots of different photography processes. So do look up Josie Purcell's podcast. Next up, I'm taking you all the way back to episode 9, where I sat down with the brilliant Rebecca Milford to talk about the icon that is Frida Kahlo. In this little snippet, you'll hear Rebecca and I discuss Frida's love life, her great losses, and the importance clothing played to her identity.
This is such an interesting work, and after she'd gone through so much, because as well, like her personal life, as you said, with her partner was incredibly tempestuous and very fiery, as well as dealing with all these sort of health issues. There was also a lot of, not love loss per se, but there was a lot of drama in her personal life.
Oh yeah, huge amount of drama in her personal life. Like, she didn't have anything easy. She fell in love with Diego, who was this, a revolutionary, and she fell in love with him for his mind and his soul. Apparently, I think there are some references to him looking a bit like a toad. Like, he's not a good looking guy. And if you look at any photos of them, she's this tiny little woman and he's like this huge, almost quite grotesque man. But he was a real kind of forward thinker, and I think that's what probably attracted her to him. And he was 20 years older than her, and they tried to have a baby, and then she had a miscarriage, so she kind of had to deal with that pain as well, and the pain of all of his betrayals. So yeah, it's like her kind of life was littered with these heartaches one way or the other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when you see them both together, they're a very striking pair, but they're a very odd pair. Her mother hated Diego, but her dad, because he was so well established, as you said, he was 20 years her senior. He was quite a famous mural painter in Mexico, and because he was quite wealthy, her father approved of the marriage because he was like, oh, she can take care of her. But their mother used to refer to them as the elephant and the dove.
I know, it's so funny.
But I was like, also, only mother-in-laws could really get away with saying something so like cutting.
I know, yeah. I think he probably just took it on the chin, but still, he was definitely not a fan. And when you learn that he had an affair with Frida's own sister, you do kind of think, come on, dude.
Yeah, there's crossing the line. No, absolutely. So you mentioned there that Frida actually suffered a miscarriage, and there's a very, very famous painting that Frida made after her miscarriage, which it's quite haunting actually, and it's called the Henry Ford Hospital. Have I got the name of this?
Yeah, that one's right. It's also known as the floating bed. And yeah, she had the miscarriage in 1932, and she also painted this like very shortly after. And you're right, harrowing and haunting is exactly the words. It kind of shows a naked, twisted Frida, still bloated from pregnancy, on a hospital bed, and there are these red ribbons that look kind of like, I suppose, umbilical cords or veins, and they're coming from her, and floating around the bed are these 6 objects. And one of them is a snail, to kind of show how slow the operation and the abortion was. One of them is a pelvic bone that kind of illustrates her crippled body and what went wrong. And one of them is a fetus, to show the unborn child. And apparently she actually requested, about a week after the miscarriage, she requested the fetus from the hospital because she wanted to paint it directly, but they refused her, so she had to make do with medical illustrations.
Like you can't say she wasn't of a strong disposition. My goodness.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's also a couple of other things there. There's like a wilted flower that's there, and then something also that looks like, I think, is it a lock and key or something? It's a very sort of weird.
I think it's object, like hospital machinery. It's kind of supposed to signify the hospital, and it was also in the Henry Ford Hospital in the States, so that's like what the backdrop is as well. You kind of like see and the Ford manufacturing plant as well. So I think for me that really signifies how far she felt from home when this was happening. Like, she wasn't in her beloved Mexico, and she wasn't surrounded by the traditions and the comforting things that she knew. So it's a real sign of alienation.
Yeah, because they moved to the States for Diego because he was given several commissions, but Frida missed Mexico, so she moved back after a few years. But I think that was not really round about the breakup of their marriage, because, like you said, they divorced in 1939. But it kind of takes us on to another painting which you brought to my attention, called The Two Fridas.
Yeah, so this kind of represents Frida's pain in a different way. This is more of an emotional pain. And at first, I think when she painted it, she said that it was from kind of like a dream or a memory she had of this imaginary friend when she was younger. But then she acquiesced a bit later on that it was due to the emotional turmoil she felt after divorcing from Diego. But it kind of shows these two versions of herself sitting almost facing each other. And one of them is in very traditional Mexican dress. And this one is shown with an exposed, broken heart, and this heart is like bleeding all over her lap. And in the other version, she's in modern dress with a whole heart. And it kind of shows the two sides of her personality and her desperation and loneliness, and how she really, she wants to follow her heart, but her heart lies with Diego, and this causes her pain. And so it's kind of, for me, her trying to make sense of, well, how can you follow your heart if you know that's taking you down a route of sadness?
In the portrait where she's sitting in traditional dress, she's also sort of holding in her hand a very small amulet with a photo of Diego when he was a child, and they sit against this very stormy backdrop, which for me, it's all about that, how even though she's in two minds, clearly, that she has strength in herself and that she can make a decision and will follow her heart eventually. I think it's so interesting because, that you mentioned previously, it was a very fiery relationship. He cheated on her several times, but their divorce also follows some of Frida's infidelity as well. She had an affair with Leon Trotsky, a very famous Russian revolutionary.
Well, she had multiple affairs as well, actually, with men and women. So, she wasn't exactly completely
angel of virtue.
But no, he was actually staying with her in the Casa Azul, in the Blue House. So this was a period in Diego and Frida's life where they had a lot of revolutionaries and artists and writers that would come around to their house and talk about sort of revolutionary ideas. And Trotsky was in Mexico because he'd been exiled from Russia, and he was staying at Casa Azul, and his wife was over as well, so she was in the picture, but Frida had an affair with him. Yeah.
Blue House is quite an interesting place. Like you said, they had a lot of artists sort of coming and going, but it really was the hub of Frida's existence almost, and her artistic outpour. So she was born in this house, and obviously she lived with Diego in this house, and she died in this house as well. But what I think so incredible is how vibrant the entire house is. I mean, I've never been fortunate enough like yourself to visit there, but I watched a sort of virtual sort of walkthrough, and the house is just incredible.
It's just beautiful. It is that kind of bright peacock blue that almost seems too blue. You know, your eyes can't really take it in. And it's got like a courtyard in the middle. It's very traditionally built, and it's got sort of fountains and flora everywhere. And you can kind of walk around the grounds, and you can kind of really imagine her going out and kind of sitting there in the morning with her coffee and her breakfast of tamales. And she had pet monkeys, so they would kind of be running around, and there were parrots and birds, and you really do sense what you're surrounded by when you go there. And I think that's why I love it as well, because although there are these harrowing and disturbing paintings that she does, a lot of her self-portraits, especially the kind of ones from the shoulders up, there are a lot of flowers and greenery and parrots and monkeys and these, it's almost like love letters to Mexico and to the Casa Azul. So for all of the paintings that are quite dark and show her grief and her pain, there are equally ones that show how much she loved life and how appreciative she was to be surrounded by this.
Well, that's it exactly. And she's someone who very famously is known for her striking looks and her appearance and her sense of dress. And there's all this, I mean, reading before recording with you, I was reading this thing where they said that she preferred these sort of traditional Mexican dresses because when she was working abroad, it showed her love of her home nation and sort of let her stand out in a crowd almost. And she really did love that. And she used to wear these incredible hair bands and style her hair very high as a way of sort of drawing attention away from her lower body. Because she had also
and if you'd like to listen to that episode in full, that is episode 9 of season 1, and that is Frida Kahlo with Rebecca Milford. Once again, thank you so much to Rebecca. I learned so much in this episode. Frida Kahlo is somebody who is such an icon in today's world, and in terms of, you might not perhaps know her work, but you'll know her to look at. She's got incredibly distinguishing features that you'll see on tote bags or cushions or badges and whatever else. She's just, just catapulted into an otherly realm of art celebrity. And her work is just so beautiful and so important and so revolutionary for its time. She was amazing, and just the strength that she had with all the illnesses that she had and all the loss. And she's just someone I really admire and completely underestimated for most of my art history career until I actually sat down and gave her a little bit of time that she deserved. So I completely owe all that to Rebecca. So thank you so much. Next up, we are returning from Frida Kahlo and Mexico to the British Isles to reintroduce you to Peggy Angus. Peggy Angus was a British designer, artist and educator born in 1904. Although born in Chile, her family relocated back to the UK when she was 5, and she grew up in Muswell Hill in London. At 17, she won a scholarship to study at the Royal College of Art and studied alongside now world-renowned artists Barbara Hepworth and Henry Moore. Peggy is best known for her love of pattern and design, and spent a large part of her career making incredible pattern tiles and murals for architectural projects around the UK, as well as handmade wallpaper. In this episode, I sat down with the brilliant Claire Dales, who got in touch to tell me all about Peggy Angus. Here's a little snippet from our chat. Enjoy.
Not back to basics about it, but there's you get so much joy in creating something out of a non-traditional material, and also just getting a little bit messy, I think. And I think Peggy as a teacher, I've read some like students that because she was incredibly influential, and I've read quite a lot from her students that essentially were like, she was the person that, you know, she really challenged us to travel and think independently and to create and enjoy the sort of the whole aspect of creating. And for me, what I find really interesting is that and this completely makes sense, actually, you sort of going back a little bit to when she qualified as a teacher. I read and I got hold of her obituary, and I'll leave a link to that in the description in the show notes below. And it was really interesting because it was written by an ex-pupil, and she said that Peggy told her that when she qualified as a teacher, she kind of wept because she didn't want it to sort of deter her from her art practice, so she only ever taught part-time, and very much sort of used it as a inspire the next generation, but also she still had room to create. So I think it's just so impressive how she divided her time, and she knew that it was important to create, yes, but also to sort of teach this next generation of women, because this was a girls' school, that you can create all these beautiful things and just explore it as well. Just the idea of exploration in Peggy's work. You mentioned that she, in the 1930s, she founded the Artists International Association. I couldn't really find very much on that. Is that something that's still very much going today? Or, because I know Peggy, her network, and she very much was inspired by William Morris and his idea of the arts and crafts movement. Is this something that she just wanted to use it as like a network of artists to encourage international collaboration?
Yeah, I think from what I can gather, as you say, it's quite hard to find out a lot of, you know, how these things sort of came about and such. But I think that was basically it, that sort of pre or between the First and Second World Wars, it was a way of putting people together and forming a network of artists. I think much in the same way that people, you know, created unions for, you know, basket makers or cutlers or whatever. And then as the time goes on, some of those groups join together to form larger groups. But I think that was basically it. It's about putting people together and creating a voice. Especially, I think, obviously, at that time in the sort of mid to late 30s in Eastern Europe and Russia, people who were creative in any way, you know, artists, musicians, poets, and so forth, could feel you know, the weight of where things are going politically. And obviously in you know, war situations, or when somebody is trying to dominate the political landscape, often it's people who are creative are seen as, you know, somewhat dangerous, because they have a way of communicating ideas and thoughts, or just promoting or sparking thinking, not necessarily promoting an idea or point of view, but just, you know, a sort of a questioning in attitude in people, and sparking curiosity and that sort of thing in people. So I think it was a way of sort of uniting people who may have become you know, sort of disparate or isolated in their own work or practice, or geographically maybe.
I love
putting
that.
them all together. But yeah, it's really interesting what you say about one of the conditions of her scholarship to the RCA was that she had to go back to the school to teach, but actually she used it as a sort of a force for good, and to give a probably a, you know, a bit of a release almost in the curriculum, where the students could sort of explore and experiment. And I'm sure her art classes were just that. But as you say, create a balance and have time where she could actually create her own things and not be completely tied to teaching, but to have the space to develop her own practice. After the war, Peggy went to live near Lewes in a little cottage, which still exists, but it's a private house, so people shouldn't be trudging up the drive to find it. It's called Furlongs, and it's really well known because one of her friends, Ravilius, came to stay and actually did a really lovely painting and lithograph of it, and that's quite well known. And it's interesting, I think, if you Google Peggy Angus, one of the first images that comes up is an image that Ravilius did of Furlong. So it's not necessarily even Peggy Angus's own images, it's, you know, a male artist as it were, sort of pops into that slot. But it's really beautiful, and I think it's like a lot of artists after the war who lived in London, moved out to the countryside around, still London was still accessible, and a lot of people still kept a foothold in the town, but you could still just get up there in an hour by train, yet you were miles from anywhere and had space to bring up the children, an open landscape, fresh air. And it's a really beautiful spot. It's only half an hour to into the village or the town of Lewes. It's 20 minutes from the sea, and the light there is just really lovely. It's really beautiful, and you can see that would inspire anybody. And the house itself, although it's obviously privately owned by or inhabited by somebody at the moment, she actually printed her own walls. She made wallpaper, but actually printed the walls in the house as well, and created lots of furnishings and things for the house.
Yeah, I love this. And again, very much harking back to sort of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement. So you said that she created her wallpaper. Was the wallpaper the thing that she became known for first, or was it the tiles? Because I know she also made tiles.
Yes, I think, well, her husband was an editor. He became editor of the Architect's Journal. He was an architect to start with, and he was able to, even though their marriage dissolved, they separated, he introduced her to a lot of quite sort of useful and influential people. And one of those was the Poole pottery and the Carters of Poole, who made sort of useful ceramic objects, dishes and so forth, but obviously were hugely influential in tile making. And they made roof tiles, and the Carter's own house in Poole, which I've had the luck to visit, very beautiful, has amazing sort of teal blue wave-like curled tiles on the roof of the house. And they also created tiles for domestic interiors, sort of bathrooms and so forth. But at a time when this was still largely pre-antibiotics, and people were quite concerned with cleanliness in the home and having a scrubbable, clean surface. And also in the 30s and 40s, that sort of clean aesthetic was very fashionable. So it was like just a two waves meeting at the correct point. The Poole pottery were making huge amounts of tiles, and she was just the very best designer to come on board with them. And one of the images that you've got there is actually of tiles that she made for Poole potteries. And the way that they became so popular was, I think, their flexibility of use. So the tiles themselves are quite simple geometric shapes, and some of them were stamped onto the tiles. A lot of them were screen printed, so it was quite easy to change the colours of the tiles and to mass produce them quite accurately, so that if you picked one tile, you could arrange them in any number of ways to create different patterns on a wall, and the designs would match up. So the line on the edge of one tile would match up with the line on the edge of the other. And they became really popular, and they were used in schools and private houses, but they really took off. A lot of the London architects used them in schools because they were seen as hygienic and quite fun. There's an image there of which is actually Heathrow Airport, and although it's a black and white image, and a lot of the images at the time are black and white, the colours of the tiles were really quite striking. So you could create a real sort of feature wall, and often that's where they were used in entrance halls or in cafeterias or stairways, where it's a really practical material because, of course, it can take sort of knocks and scuffs and so forth. And a lot of them are still there. If the school hasn't been demolished, the wall's still there and is in as good a nick as it was, the day it was put up.
And if you would like to hear that conversation in full, that is episode 29 of season 1, Peggy Angus with Claire Dales. Again, another artist that I completely missed off my radar and probably never would have heard of her had Claire not come on and spoke so brilliantly about her. It's a really great episode, so I would definitely recommend that you go back and listen to it. So episode 29 of season 1. Well, we are now on to our last snippet for our International Women's Day special 2022 for Jo's Art History podcast. And it would be ignorant of me, really, not to include a snippet of an episode from this last artist, or all about this last artist, should I say. It is the one, the only Tracey Emin. Now, Tracey Emin is probably the most requested artist I've had on the podcast in terms of when I put open calls out for people to come on and talk about an artist of their choice. Every season, I at least have 3 or 4 people write in to say, oh, can I speak about Tracey Emin, or can I do this? And really, I think for season 3 or season 4, I'm going to get a couple of people on and have one big podcast episode where there's maybe like 4 or 5 of us, where we all just talk about Tracey and how brilliant we think she is, or how not great she thinks she is. It's always good to get a second opinion on things as well. But I completely love Tracey Emin, and it seems only right to sort of throw back to my very first podcast episode about her. I now have 2, but my very first podcast episode was with the brilliant British photographer Kerry Curl, who spoke so brilliantly about Tracey Emin's bed. This was recorded during the 3rd lockdown in the UK, so at the end of 2020, which seems, oh goodness, like 4,000 years ago. But this was a fantastic conversation, and I remember hanging up with Kerry after I'd finished recording and just being like, that was just so good. Like, that was just such a great conversation. And I really hope you enjoy this snippet.
I think it's just such a personal space, the bed, isn't it? You know, whoever's bed it is, whether it's Tracey Emin's, yours, mine, your neighbours, it's a really personal space that you don't get to, you don't really get to see. And if you have guests to stay, you make sure that the bedrooms are really nice and tidy. And well, I don't know, I won't tie you with the same brush, but I've definitely done that thing where it's like, oh my God, just open the cupboard door and stick everything in. The room needs to look tidy. So I just think to be able to look at all of this debris, and really was controversial at the time. So this was back in 1999, this piece, wasn't it? And it was part of the Turner Prize, which I had to actually look who won that year, because it was Steve McQueen, because I think the My Bed installation and Tracey Emin as a person kind of is really associated with that year. So I had to actually have a look who did win it, because it wasn't Tracey Emin.
Well, that's it, because she got so much, sorry to interrupt, she got so much like media coverage from it, and it really was the thing that sort of drew everyone to the Turner Prize, because everyone was like, how is this art? But that was something I didn't Google, actually. Was it this year? Because she did win the Turner Prize eventually, but it wasn't this year.
So the controversy, I did actually find a couple of really interesting quotes, actually. So the culture secretary, who at the time was Chris Smith, so he criticised the jury for choosing what he called, quote, shock installations, which he felt gave the country a bad rep in the art world. And there was another one, which is probably one of my favourite responses ever. It feels like it needs to be like a strapline on an album cover or the back of a book or something. So someone said, "It makes me so angry to see these so-called artists glorifying a messy bedroom. What is the world coming to when a major art exhibition sends out this message?" And that was said by someone described only as a mother who was interviewed in The Sun in October 99. And I just thought, sorry mum, that's such a sorry mum thing, isn't it?
No, I know. It's so funny as well, because obviously Tracey is part of that group, which is known as the YBAs, so the Young British Artists, who, for people listening that maybe don't know, they really came to force at the end of the 80s into the 90s, and particularly round about 97, there was a huge big exhibition at the Royal Academy of Arts in London called Sensation, where Charles Saatchi, who very much championed these young artists, it was people like Damien Hirst, Marcus Harvey, Sarah Lucas, Tracey Emin, of course, and people were queuing out the door, but it caused a sensation, to quite rightly, and it really helped put British art on the map. It's really such a funny thing, but I feel even Tracey herself says it, that the bed, the longer people have had to sort of get used to it, it's probably aged better than probably what it was received at the beginning, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it really does. Well, she talks a lot. I mean, her work is really kind of you know, it's very autobiographical and confrontational, and it's confessional. And I think what I really like about her as a person is, you know, whether it's through her art or when you see her interviewed, is that she is really inspiringly unapologetic for what she produces and what her processes are and what her thoughts are. So I just think to take what is a very personal space, so it was her bed, and it was complete with unwashed stained sheets, and surrounding it were condoms and underwear and fag packets, and there was period blood, and you know, this showed a real kind of state of mind and a real kind of unhealthy physical space during a period of time when she was really depressed. And I think we do talk about mental health an awful lot now, but I think it's really easy to forget that that isn't how it's always been. So sort of certainly in 1999, I mean, my mother had like numerous mental health issues. So I can say, you know, coming from a place of experiencing it and living with it, that certainly in the 90s and in the 2000s, you know, people weren't talking about mental health. And this work addresses so much of it in a time when, you know, it was something people didn't discuss. Certainly they didn't go into an art exhibition to look at it. And I just think that's really interesting. I think she's really forward thinking with a lot of the work that she's made. So I think people often talk about David Bowie being a time traveller because of this kind of forward thinking and, you know, his the way that he approached his work, being quite unafraid to be innovative. And I just, for me, I think Tracey Emin really has that time traveller status too. I think, you know, dealing with things like mental health, you know, expressing your emotions in a time when that wasn't what we did, you know, is ahead of the curve. And, you know, and it isn't just the themes of mental health in her work. It's always, you know, it's sex from a woman's perspective, and it's her use of language. And I just think she's a really interesting creative, and the breadth of her work is and the materials that she uses is just phenomenal.
No, I would completely agree, and I think she gets a lot of bad stick on the outside of things, like that article that you sent me, that we'll talk about a wee bit later on, about her neon works and things like the one that was unveiled in St Pancras. Like, it's scathing, and I must say, it wasn't really until I saw Tracey's most recent, okay, bar the Royal Academy one, which is happening at the moment, but obviously tier 3 lockdown, thanks very much COVID. So in 2019 I went to her exhibition at White Cube called A Fortnight of Tears, and it was a whole body of work just after her mum had passed away. But the work that really shook me in, I don't know if you went to see it.
I didn't know, so I'm jealous.
Oh, it was actually the first time I cried in an exhibition, and I had to leave because I was just so like floored with how raw her message was, particularly in the room that discussed her emotions and how she really sort of held herself once her mum had passed, this pillar in her life. But it was her piece, it was called How It Feels, which is a video piece about her having an abortion, and within the context of everything that was going on, I walked out and I was like, oh my God, I get it. I get what she's about, and I understand. I just think she's incredible, and like you said, she's so forward thinking and unapologetic, and she'll just lay herself bare, and that's, you can really, really get that with her. And I think the bed is something that's, again, every time I look at it, I see something different. There's so many layers to it. It's not just this. It's very easy to look at it and go, it's just a messy bed, what the deal? But the more you sort of dig into it, like you said, you know, it's got this sort of very sort of manky, like dirty carpet. It's got all these, you know, condoms and pants and empty vodka bottles, and it really, you know, everyone can relate to periods in their life where they feel, you know, despair and loss. And I think this just completely sums it up without having to really say anything about it.
I think as well, you can almost, just from looking at it, even in a picture, not being next to it in the physical, it's like you can almost smell it as well. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it just kind of like, it's if you can, now I guess if you can kind of like just go with it, it is a bit of a sensory overload. You know, it is more than just being a one-dimensional image in a book. So it is yeah, it's crazy. And I think as well, you know, what people don't give this artist enough credit for is that she left school at 15. Although I'm reading her book Strangeland at the moment, which is just incredible. So yeah, if anyone hasn't read that, I highly recommend reading it. It's really accessible, and I say that as someone who I'm still trying to figure out Susan Sontag, but that's a really accessible book about her life, this Strangeland, and it's great. But she left school at 15, but she says in her book that she pretty much stopped going at 13.
Oh, even now, I love listening back to that. Kerry speaks so brilliantly and passionately about Tracey Emin and the bed. It's a full hour-long episode, so if you would like to listen to that, it is episode 15 of season 1. And there you have it. That is the end of the International Women's Day special for Jo's Art History podcast. And there you have it, another episode of Jo's Art History podcast, and more importantly, our International Women's Day special for 2022. I absolutely loved going back into these episodes and picking out some of my favourite snippets from each. There were so many brilliant episodes that were dedicated to women artists. However, what I did notice is that most of my episodes are dedicated to male artists. So perhaps it's time to readdress that imbalance in season 3. So if there is a woman artist that you particularly love and you enjoy listening to these podcasts and you think you could have a lovely conversation with myself, please do get in touch. And I would love to speak to you for season 3 of the podcast. You can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can DM me on Instagram @joesarthistory. I would love to speak to you, and yeah, it's a very relaxed, casual conversation, and I promise you, you will have a really good time and you'll have a lovely podcast episode to share with all your friends and family at the end of it. I really hope you have enjoyed going back into 4 of my previous episodes from seasons 1 and 2, all about women artists. And if you have enjoyed it so much that you feel that someone else you know would enjoy it, please feel free to pass it on to them. It would be great to get as many people listening to the podcast as possible. If you are listening on iTunes and would like to leave a review, please do. It means the world to me. And you can also now leave a review if you're listening on Spotify. And you can mark the podcast out of 5 stars. So, it is my birthday. So if you want to give me 5 stars, that would be lovely. Thank you so much. Finally, I've been Jo McLaughlin, your host and your resident art historian here on Jo's Art History podcast, and it's been brilliant to celebrate International Women's Day with you, and I look forward to welcoming you next time on the podcast. Until then, keep learning, and remember, art is for all. Bye.